I know that Theresa, our speaker, has been researching this for quite some time, actually. So anyways, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to her, our own Theresa Hanley. She's been on our board for a couple of years now. She has been on the board of the Mission Inn Foundation. She has been one of the curators of the Mission Inn Foundation years ago, and was the director of the Ontario Museum for a number of years too. So she's eminently qualified, and like I said, she's been doing this research for quite some time. So we're looking forward to our topic today, which is Frank Miller and the peace movement. Although she gave a better title than that. So Theresa, we'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
All right, thank you. Well, welcome everyone. I have looked through the participant list to see a number of familiar names and some new ones too. So if I haven't met you, thanks for joining today, and I hope you enjoy it. So if we can, my technical assistant, go ahead and start there with the slides. Let's just hold on just a moment and see if the slides come up. There we go, very good. All right. So the title of my talk is Peace and Friendship, Frank Miller's Internationalism. So I wanted to start, yeah, go ahead to the next slide there, please, the Peace Tower. So why is it that we think about Frank Miller as a peace advocate? Of course, one of the biggest elements in our community is the Peace Tower on Mount Rubidoux. And here in the slide, I've placed on the right the wording on the plaque there. And I think it says it very nicely, all of the elements of why various aspects of Frank Miller's life and personality, and why we think about him as a peace advocate: peace with justice, civic beauty, community righteousness, and world peace. Another reason I think is that particularly for people, say my age or slightly older, might have some living memory of a group called the Institute of International Relations, which met at the Mission Inn, founded in 1926, Miller as a co-founder. That group met at the Mission Inn into the 1960s, and then the local World Affairs Council was a kind of descendant of that group, and also met at the Mission Inn for many years. So those of us with a little bit deeper knowledge know that Miller held a peace conference at the Mission Inn way back in 1911. And then we know various, again, various tidbits of history, or not tidbits, but important elements of Miller's history in regard to his activities, things that in particular go to that notion of peace with justice. His hosting of Booker T. Washington at the Mission Inn, and his hosting of the interracial memorial service on Washington's death in 1915. We know that he supported the Harada family in their alien land law case, and then also, we know just about the nature of the architecture and his world collections, multicultural collections, all going to this notion of Frank Miller as having an interest in international affairs and peace. And then finally, I think that one thing that's very important is that Zona Gale, in her 1937 biography of Frank Miller, makes his peace activism an important, large part of her portrayal of Miller. So could go to the next slide, please. So here is an artifact, little scene artifact in the Mission Inn collections from 1915 that suggests that there really is more to Frank Miller's peace activism than we have traditionally understood. So today I'll take a deeper look at Miller's peace activism, and particularly in his actions during the World War I era, that I hope will help us better understand Miller's own peace activism, and also look at how it was part of a broader national and international context. So to that context, what I'd like you to keep in mind as I go through the presentation is that the peace activists of Miller's time were developing an essentially new idea. And this idea was that peace would mean something not beyond, something not just the absence of war, but would mean a system of internationally accepted norms, institutions, and processes by which the people and nations of the world would settle their disputes in nonviolent ways. From at least 1907 until his death in 1935, Miller engaged in these efforts. Most often what I see is that he himself called it peace work. At his death, one obituary of him referred to him as a peace advocate, and today we might call it peace activism or even pacifism. So because I'll be focusing quite a bit on the World War I era, I wanted to share with you, if we could go to the next slide. This is just a quote from a recent book on the peace movements before the First World War. This is from a historian named Michael Kazin, and I'll let you read that while I just talk to you a little bit about who were these peace activists in these years before World War I, because it was quite an interesting group of people. So there were people as famous as William Jennings Bryan, the great orator, and later Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State. Helen Keller was a peace activist. Andrew Carnegie and Henry Ford. Also social reformers like Jane Addams. Political reformers like the La Follette family of Wisconsin. Radical activists and politicians like John Reed, Emma Goldman, and Max Eastman. If you've seen the movie Reds, you've seen all of them. And Eugene Debs, the socialist labor leader who ran for president from prison during this period. Closer to Frank Miller, we'll talk about Albert and Daniel Smiley, David Starr Jordan, Zona Gale, who I've already mentioned, a very interesting woman named Aletta Jacobs, a man named Edwin Jen, and then from right here in Riverside, Stella Irvine. What we do know, what do we know about Miller's origins in peace, his interests in peace? There are some intriguing possibilities. His mother, of course, we know had Quaker roots on her side of the family. His father had served in the Union Army during the Civil War. Many of Miller's fellow peace advocates were of his generation and had grown up with their parents' accounts and other accounts of the horrors of the Civil War. But today, I'm going to start with a character we know in Mission Inn and Riverside history a little better, and that's Teddy Roosevelt. So can we go to the next slide? So there he is on the left at the Mission Inn, replanting the orange tree. Roosevelt is the one with the shovel. And then to his left, or right on the screen, Isabella Miller and Frank Miller. So throughout the 1880s and the 1890s, Miller's original hotel building, called variously the Glenwood Cottages, the Glenwood Hotel, sometimes the Glenwood Tavern, is growing both physically and in stature as a popular Southern California resort hotel. Miller's innate enthusiasm and genial nature is also developing into the nimble skills of a talented hotel man. His clientele is increasingly international and consequently introduces him to a wider world. Soon after the opening of the new Glenwood, what we now call the Mission Wing of the Mission Inn, partially seen here, comes that Teddy Roosevelt celebrated visit to Riverside. And this was in May of 1903. So not long after that visit, Roosevelt is involved in negotiating an end to the Russo-Japanese War. And in 1906, he is among the earliest recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize for his good office's role in ending that war. And on the right of your screen, there is a Harper's Weekly cover depicting his efforts. One of the things another reason why Roosevelt was given that early Peace Prize, and it's not as well remembered, but it is important, is that Roosevelt was among the first world leaders to use the new permanent court of arbitration. It had been established at the Hague Peace Conference in 1899, and he took a border dispute between the United States and Mexico to that permanent court of arbitration. Was one of the first world leaders to do that, and so that was another reason why he was honored with the Nobel Peace Prize. So not long after this picture, in 1904, we know that Miller's young adult daughter, Alice, traveled first to the St. Louis World's Fair and then east to the East Coast, and then on to Europe. In London, she joined up with the Young Ladies Travel and Residential School, run by an Italian art historian and his Yankee wife. She kept a diary, and she wrote long letters to her parents describing her experiences. And so much of what I'm sharing with you, I learned of through those letters and diaries. And then also in November of 1904, two visitors come to the Mission Inn. They're from the Netherlands. They are Aletta Jacobs and her husband, Carol Victor Gerritsen. Through the visit, the Millers and the Jacobs Gerritsens arranged for Alice to visit Amsterdam and visit with Jacobs and Gerritsen when her school contract ends in the summer of 1905. So can we see the next slide then? So here are pictures. On the left, the color image is a photograph of the Georgia Melville Stone painting of Alice Miller. I think this is actually about 1910, so a little later than the dates in our story, but still pretty representative of what she would have looked like. And on the right is Aletta Jacobs. And this is about the time that she would have known the Millers. So let me tell you a little bit about Aletta Jacobs. She was the first woman to be educated, trained, and to practice as a physician in the Netherlands. Early in her career, she practiced in London with Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, another pioneering woman doctor. She met birth control pioneer Annie Besant and spent time with the Fabian socialists and other socio-political thinkers. She became dedicated to women's health issues, and upon her return to the Netherlands, opened a women's clinic at which she dispensed birth control advice and services. She redesigned what was called the Missinga Pessiary, and as a result, sometimes she is referred to as the inventor of the diaphragm. This is all about 30 years before Margaret Sanger's work in birth control in New York, and about 20 years before she met the Millers in 1904. Jacobs was also a very active suffragist. She was the head of the Dutch National Suffrage Organization for many years, and she was also very active in international suffrage organizations. She became a peace advocate also, at least in the beginning, through her husband's work. He was a member of a group called the Interparliamentary Union, which met at that World's Fair in St. Louis in 1904. She traveled with him to St. Louis for the meeting, and then the delegates of the Interparliamentary Union toured the United States after the meeting, and this is when the Jacobs and her husband traveled to Riverside and stayed at the Mission Inn and met Frank and Isabella Miller. Okay, the next slide. So the next step in our story comes in 1907, and this is when many of us know that the Millers took their family trip to Europe. The first time Frank Miller was in Europe, and probably Isabella too, but the second trip for Alice. And so what you're looking at are passport applications from the National Archives. On the left is Frank Miller's application, and you can see his occupation is listed as hotel keeper. On the right, his daughter Alice Miller, and her occupation is hotel proprietress. So we have tended to think about this meeting, this trip, as in regard to the effect that it had on Frank Miller and his ideas for his hotel and his collections. But it's also important to note that on this trip, they also visited with Aletta Jacobs in Amsterdam in August of 1907. So let's go to the next slide. And that visit was among the longest stops of any that they took or that they had on their trip. And as you'll read here, this is from Alice's diary, Alice Miller, the daughter's travel diary. Jacobs took them to The Hague, and it was then in the midst of the second of the two major peace conferences that were held there. So at the turn of the 20th century, there were these two important peace conferences held at The Hague, one in 1899, second in 1907. Both resulted in a series of multilateral negotiated treaties and conventions, among the first steps in developing this system of international law. Perhaps the most important achievement, as we've seen in 1899, was that permanent court of arbitration that Roosevelt had used. The second peace conference in 1907 is generally considered to have been less successful in terms of broad international agreements. For us, however, in Mission in History, it's very important and has a very interesting kind of side element. So let's go to the next slide. So throughout this conference at The Hague, peace activists from Britain, Europe, Asia, and the United States were all converging on the Hague. Now, these were not the official conference delegates, but journalists, writers, representatives from various peace groups. For example, there was a woman named Fanny Garrison Viard, who was president of the International Council of Women. She was there with other civic and reform-minded people who might have been there representing their organization, or perhaps they were just there as individuals. Among the most flamboyant of the people attending were a man named W.T. Stead, and you see him there on the left. Stead was a British journalist who is widely credited with developing what was sometimes called a new journalism, a kind of tabloid journalism, which was very heavy on images, interviews, investigations, and plenty of opinion. Each day during the conference, Stead published a review of conference activities and had it delivered to conference delegates and others at The Hague. That's what you see an example of that on the right. Many considered it a better account of the conference than official reports. Stead also held regular side gatherings in the afternoons and evenings, featuring talks by noted peace activists. It was called Le Cercle International, French. Remember, French is the international language of diplomacy. So remember up above in Alice's diary account, pardon me, she said that Dr. Jacobs had taken them to a meeting of a circle that dealt with international affairs. So this is that gathering, and she took them there on August 14th. So that evening, Stead himself was the speaker, and Alice recorded some of his talk in her travel diary. So what I want you to just keep in mind from this one is that, you know, visiting their friend Aletta Jacobs, all of a sudden the Millers find themselves in the midst of some of the most vocal, ardent, and devoted of the world's peace advocates. So let's go on to the next slide, and I'm going to take just a breath and a bit of water, and I'll be right back while you look at this beautiful picture of the music room. So the Millers returned to Riverside after their European trip. There's a lot of energy and concentration. There are several interviews with Miller about their trip in the local newspaper, and a lot of his energy is concentrated on this new edition, which is what we know as the Cloister Wing. And this, of course, is the music room. This fabulous photograph of the historic music room, and you can see that he's beginning to stray quite a bit from the imagery of the California missions, and lots and lots of European and other world influences in the architecture and in the collections that he's displaying around the hotel. So this is an energetic time, but also a sad one, because as we know, Isabella Miller is increasingly ill, and she died in the summer of 1908. So between these years, Miller's activities are centered around the new addition to his hotel, the very personal challenges of Isabella's death, and then as we move in towards the end of 1910, his emerging relationship with Marion Clark, who he became his second wife, and he married her in December of 1910. But during this time, there are things happening elsewhere at the national and international level that will circle back to involve Miller. So if we go to the next slide, please. We can start with his friends, the Smileys from nearby Redlands. So of course we think of them in regard to their work in Redlands, but recall that they also operated a resort hotel in upstate New York called the Mohonk Mountain House. And beginning in 1895, Albert Smiley and his half-brother Daniel held annual peace gatherings at Mohonk Mountain House. And the attendees were businessmen, religious, and education leaders. And what you see on your screen here is a bit of the letterhead for the Lake Mohonk Conference on International Arbitration, and then a photograph of the people gathered for one of those meetings. You can see just a bit of the Mountain House there in the background. So one of the points I wanted to make here is that in this setting, the word arbitration it is a synonym for peace. Of course, vocabularies vary in different times, and while some of the most popular peace advocates, writers, artists, religious advocates, would often use the word peace, others, especially businessmen, educators, and diplomats, used more institutionally based terms. So arbitration, negotiation, even disarmament are some of the words that you hear. But they were all, again, advocating this new idea that peace meant something other than simply the absence of war, and that this would be the wave of the future. So the next slide. So a frequent attendee at this Mohonk conference on arbitration was a man named Edwin Ginn, and we see there a portrait of him. And his peace efforts would come to play an important role in the activities at the Mission Inn. Ginn's fortune came from his business as a textbook publisher, and he was particularly enthusiastic about the role of public education in promoting peace. His earliest conception of how to utilize his fortune for peace was to establish an international school of peace. He desperately wanted David Starr Jordan, who was then the president of Stanford University, to lead his school, and that's Jordan on the right. Gradually, the idea of this the School of Peace became the World Peace Foundation, and Ginn employed 4 key people to disseminate his peace ideals. David Starr Jordan in the United States, a man named James MacDonald in Canada, a man named Norman Angell in England, and a 4th representative whose name slips my mind in continental Europe. His World Peace Foundation also funded a group called the American School Peace League, led by a woman named Fannie Fern Andrews, and we'll hear a little bit more about them in a bit. So throughout this first decade of the century, Frank Miller was also building a personal friendship with David Starr Jordan. Miller's daughter, Alice, on that trip in 1905, after her visit with Jacobs, Alice Miller joined the Jordan family and continues to travel in Europe. And as Jordan was developing his own work relationship with Ginn and the World Peace Foundation, Jordan, increasingly involved Miller and the Mission Inn. At one time, boldly asking Miller to recruit some of Miller's rich hotel guests into Ginn's activities as donors to the World Peace Foundation. So how about the next slide? And this is how the 1911 Peace Conference comes to happen at the Mission Inn. The conference was funded by Ginn's World Peace Foundation, and its content was developed by Jordan as part of Jordan's contract with Ginn. Jordan referred to it as My Peace Conference in his correspondence to others, and included an account of the conference in his activities report to Ginn. Nevertheless, the relationship with Jordan is strengthening Miller's commitments to peace. And so in December of 1912, Zona Gale quotes a letter from Miller to various international consuls and their offices in California, in which Miller, after first complaining about the United States government's lack of participation in the Permanent Court of Arbitration, Miller says outright, "We individual citizens feel it incumbent upon each of us to do all we can to bring about the ultimate realization of our dream of universal and enduring peace." So as we know, this is 1912, December of 1912, so in just a couple of years, these peace dreams would be dashed by the outbreak of war, what we now know as World War I. The atrocities in Belgium and the horrors of trench warfare were recounted daily on the front pages of local papers. But also the peace advocates and activists would put up one valiant last stand. Again, this is what Michael Kazin, the historian, calls a war against war. So before we look at Miller's specific peace activities, in this war against war, I want to just take a quick step back and take a broader look at the state of the peace ideas in the first decade of the 20th century. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. It's a little more interesting. We can broadly summarize, I'm going to broadly summarize 4 major perspectives of the peace advocates. The first idea is one that is that peace is a part of a natural evolution of humankind. This was often the perspective of artists and intellectuals, writers like the one you see here. This is a woman named Bertha von Suttner who published a book, there's the title page on the right, Lay Down Your Arms. This was published in 1889. It's a melodramatic story of a woman who loses 2 husbands to war. And I just wanted to point out real quickly to all of us Californians that Lay Down Your Arms is published in 1889, and a few years earlier in 1884, Helen Hunt Jackson had published Ramona, a similarly romanticized version of a political situation. So von Suttner's book, Lay Down Your Arms, was a bestseller. She had worked for a while for Alfred Nobel, and it is believed that she influenced him towards establishing the Peace Prize. She was a Peace Prize recipient eventually herself. She became a kind of peace celebrity, touring, speaking across the globe in the United States. She was welcomed to the White House by Teddy Roosevelt, and Andrew Carnegie funded some of her activities. She was very active with Steed's Circle International, and considered almost a kind of co-convener or co-host of that group. Another historian of the era, Margaret Macmillan, who is the author of a book called The War That Ended Peace, says that von Suttner's ideas were the product of the confident 19th century with its trust in science, rationality, and progress. Von Suttner believed that peace is a condition that the progress of civilization will bring about by necessity. War belonged to an earlier state of human evolution. This group accepted social Darwinism and the emerging ideas, even of eugenics, that war was biologically counterproductive, killing the best, the brightest, and the most noble. The second group I want to talk about a little bit was the group that just were very much interested in this notion of peace as more than the absence of war. And this was the case among politicians, elected officials, diplomats, and some academics. There was this growing belief that a new international order could be developed, and that in fact it was developing already in bits and pieces that would benefit all. Arbitration, negotiation, disarmament, these are the watchwords of this concept. We've seen the Permanent Court of Arbitration as the first step towards that. And these are the ideas that would form the basis of the League of Nations after the First World War, and ultimately the hallmarks of what we think of today as the post-World War or World War II international order. There were a third set of arguments, and these were economic arguments. Europe and the world were becoming ever more economically interdependent. American businessmen, chief among them Andrew Carnegie, already saw a global economy emerging and thought war would simply be too disruptive to be tolerated. This view exploded in the popular culture in 1910 with the publication of a book called The Great Illusion by the British journalist Norman Angell. We've heard of him before with Edwin Ginn. So Angell, actually, his actual name was Ralph Lane, because everybody should have 2 names to confuse everyone. But he was a school dropout at 14, and in his young adulthood, he had spent some time in California working as a cowboy in Bakersfield and a gold prospector. Ultimately, he became known mostly as a journalist. He also did some teaching. His work, The Great Illusion, was first published in Europe as a small pamphlet, and it was so popular that this was at the time that Carnegie had just founded his endowment for peace. And so the new Carnegie Endowment for Peace underwrote the publication in book form. And it also became a bestseller across the globe. And then fourth, of course, there were abundant religious arguments. And many, many religious leaders from numerous traditions floated in and among these other various groups of peace activists. Prominent among these were what we now call social gospel ministers, progressive Protestant ministers, with whom Miller had interacted frequently with these progressive ministers and had a lot in common with them. So let's go to the next slide. So these four concepts are basically summaries of the ideas and sentiments of those involved in peace activism. Any particular individual advocate could have identified strongly with one of these perspectives. Others might have been drawn to more than one. These were also the years that words like pacifist and pacifism began to emerge. Whatever their particular perspective, advocates were also coalescing in formally organized peace groups, holding international conferences and congresses. They organized and signed various governmental petitions and made genteel appeals to elected officials. Most of these formal peace organizations were male-dominated, and they tended to look like this. On the left is the gathering at the National Arbitration and Peace Congress in New York in April of 1907. On the right, you see one of the delegate badges. And we can see at the left of the podium, our right as we're looking at it, the man with the dark jacket and the white shirt and the little white beard is Andrew Carnegie. So these were, as I said, male dominated and tended to look very formal like this, formal meetings, formal dinners, and a very genteel kind of gatherings. So by the summer of 1914, when the war breaks out, these peace movements would be completely catalyzed by a new force, and that is women, mostly suffragists, and the tactics they had fairly recently taken up in their fight for suffrage. So let's go to the next slide. I want to take a quick side trip here into this catalyst of women's suffrage, and I promise it will bring us back to Frank Miller in a very surprisingly direct way. So women had been working at the local level across the nation to secure the vote, and were having increasing success, especially as this map shows, in the western states, but facing more resistance in the established political worlds of the rest of the country. In 1910, their tactics began to change when Alice Paul, who had spent the previous 3 years in England working among very direct action-oriented suffragists, returned to the United States. Suffragists began to march, locally at first in small numbers, but by 1912, 20,000 women marched in New York, and in 1913, the great massive parade of women suffragists, women from across the nation gathering in Washington, D.C., the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration to march for suffrage. So let's go on to the next slide. And what you're going to see, what you see here is the result of what happened as these women turned the tactics that they had previously been using in the suffrage movement towards peace in August of 1914. And I want to just take a quick moment to point out how very quickly things were happening in Europe. So Franz Ferdinand was assassinated on June 28th of 1914. That was what we think of as the point that triggered the war. And by August 2nd, so not much more than a month later, Germany had invaded Belgium and declared war on France. Again, news accounts of German atrocities in Belgium sent shockwaves throughout the Western world and among the various peace groups and advocates. Andrew Carnegie himself, then perhaps the best known peace philanthropist, quote, became an old man overnight, unquote, said his wife. And throughout the war, his relatively new peace endowment made very few grants throughout the war, as he really was almost paralyzed. I mean, they just really were, they couldn't believe that it was happening. Women activists, on the other hand, were quickly mobilized, and they turned these tactics that they'd been using for suffrage to peace. On August 29th of 1914, Fanny Garrison Viard led the Women's Peace Parade, a silent march of 1,500 women down New York's Fifth Avenue. And those are the images that you see there. So you see in the, you can see the women on the image on the left, some in their suffrage whites, others dressed in black, the traditional colors of mourning. Just a bit about Beard. She was the daughter of the great abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, and she was a veteran of many causes, a longtime suffragist. She was active in the International Council of Women. And remember that she was at that W.T. Steed's group at The Hague, the group that Letta Jacobs took the Millers to in 1907. So I don't know that the Millers met her at that time. I haven't seen any documentation to that, but I think it's pretty likely they would have recognized her name. Let's go on to the next slide. So this silent peace parade was, it was very big news. It was covered in newspapers across the country, including the press, Riverside Press. There were to be similar events across the nation, including one that was scheduled for Los Angeles on September 24th. And so on September 17th, Miller called together political, religious, and other community leaders to the Mission Inn to plan an event for Riverside. The event was ultimately held in Fairmount Park on Sunday, September 20th, headlined with a speech by a nationally known social gospel minister named Washington Gladden. His talk was called The Awful Crime of War, and the Riverside Press said several thousand people were in attendance. The assembled Riversiders adopted a pledge to support the world peace movement, and they selected individuals, including Frank Miller and Stella Irvine, to represent Riverside at the Los Angeles event. So quickly about Stella Irvine. Stella Irvine lived in Riverside, in downtown Riverside. Her house is still there, the big house with the tin roof on it at First and Brockton. She was a national leader in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was had peace as part of its platform at the time. So Miller continues his activism. This is in September, so towards the end of 1914. In 1915, Miller continues his activism. For a while, a little more quietly. Again, he's inviting peace speakers to come to the Mission Inn and to give talks in Riverside, often at the Congregational Church. And then if we go to the next slide, in May, we see Miller acting again in a more directly involved way. And I want to go back here just a bit to Edwin Jen and his World Peace Foundation. Remember, I had mentioned that he had also funded a group called the American School Peace League. So in 1913, Fern Andrews, the leader of that group, had visited California to recruit supporters and build the California School Peace League. Frank Miller was one of those that she approached. And by May 1915, Miller had arranged for a peace day for California schools. Miller had personally committed $1,000 to have one of these peace flags, like the one on the front of the brochure there, displayed in every school building in California. Peace Day was held in Riverside. 9 schools participated, and the activities of the students at those schools was reported in the daily press. An interesting thing about this is, I think, to notice that this is May 18th. So it's just about 10 days after the German attack on the Lusitania, which we usually think of as the turning point of popular political opinion on whether or not the United States should enter the war. So ideas are changing in popular sentiments. Gradually, even the staunchest of peace advocates began to waver, even some of the religious leaders that Miller most admired. Politicians began calling for preparedness. And throughout 1916, then political debate is really rampant on whether or not the United States should engage in preparedness for war or continue to stay out of the war as a neutral party or engage in even in some kind of arbitration to try to end the war. So now let's go on to the next slide, and we'll take a look at another of Miller's friends and look at her activities. And see how they might have influenced Miller. This is Zona Gale. I mentioned Zona Gale at the beginning. We know her, of course, locally as Miller's first biographer. There is one of my favorite photographs of her on the left. I'm pretty certain that that's on Mount Rubidoux. She was also a Pulitzer Prize winning novelist, the first woman to win a Pulitzer Prize as a playwright. And she was also a popular novelist. Miller asked her specifically to write his biography. She was a fellow Wisconsinite and very close to the La Follette family in Wisconsin. She was politically active as a suffragist and in civil rights causes. And she was a board member of the American Union Against Militarism. And there's the letterhead of that organization. Again, Michael Kazin, the War Against War, considers the AUAM as the most robust of all the anti-preparedness lobbying groups. In fact, in early 1916, Gale was in Washington, D.C. as the AUAM lobbied Congress to stay out of the war. And during that time, she wrote to her friend, Belle Case La Follette, that peace meetings here and peace hearings there were keeping her very busy. And so what I've done is just pulled out some of the names. I'd like to go over those a bit. Also on the executive committee, Jane Addams, again, the social reformer. Max Eastman, he was the publisher of the Masses magazine. Amos Pinchot, for those Californians, he was Gifford Pinchot's brother. Rudolph Spreckles, who was the, I think it was Sugar in the Bay Area businessman. And then Stephen Wise is Rabbi Stephen Wise. And some of us know that there is a synagogue in Los Angeles named after Stephen Wise. So she's there among some of the leading peace advocates of the country. So again, we know that these peace activists lost their efforts to keep the United States out of the war. So we might ask, just how strong was this peace effort? I'll just simply say that's a little beyond our scope today, but I will note that the peace effort was strong enough that the federal government felt it necessary to pass the Espionage and Sedition Acts to limit speech and peace activities. Peace advocates began to find themselves in their patriotism questioned. Jane Addams, the social reformer, was so, Jane Addams was so universally admired that the press sometimes called her Saint Jane, and she would later be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. But during this period, she was kicked out of the DAR and called outright unpatriotic. Newspaper headlines about peace advocates now place the word peace in quotation marks. The Sedition Act in 1918 forbade the use of disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the US government or its flag. So let's go on to the next slide, and we'll finish up with these peace flags. So since I'm a former curator, I hope you'll indulge me as I do just a little bit of what we might call provenance or object research and report on these flags. The idea of a peace flag appears to have first been suggested at the Universal Peace Congress in Rome in 1891. So if you look at, I'm talking now about the one on the far left. At that time, and for many years after, the design of a peace flag was a particular nation's flag, bordered in white to symbolize nonviolence. The image here of the white border peace flag is of an actual flag now displayed at the Mary Baker Eddy Library. It was first displayed in the home of Andrew Carnegie and then at several other locations, including the home of Betsy Ross and the gravesite of Benjamin Franklin before traveling to England. Upon its return to the United States, the flag appeared at the Interparliamentary Union's meeting during the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. Remember, that's the meeting that Jacobs and her husband, Carol Garretson, were at before they came out to California. And then in 1907, this particular flag was offered to the Mary Baker Eddy's Christian Science Church, and that's where it stayed. Another design of the peace flag appeared in association with that National Arbitration and Peace Congress in New York City in April of 1907. That was the photograph that had the image of Andrew Carnegie in it. This flag included the wording, peace for all nations, and you can kind of see that at the top. And this is the smaller image up in the right-hand corner. It was displayed during the conference, and at its conclusion was presented by the Daughters of the American Revolution to Andrew Carnegie in honor of his peace activism. So this image is a drawing or a print of the flag, which appears in a scrapbook kept by a pair of New York suffragists, mother-daughter, coincidentally also named Miller, but no relation that we know of. And then, of course, at the bottom, Frank Miller's peace flag. So recall again that pivotal moment in August of 1907 when Frank Miller, his wife Isabella, and daughter Alice visited The Hague with Aletta Jacobs. During that time, Alice recorded in her travel diary that Frank Miller was taken with the peace flag. We tried to get one later, but could not. She did not record any further details, so I don't know if it was the peace flag that captured her imagination was just the one with the white border, or the one that had appeared at the Arbitration and Peace Conference just a few months before. But he was clearly aware of the 1907 version because, as we see, the one that is in the Mission Inn collections, the one down below, is very similar with slightly altered wording, peace among all nations. And here we see it in its original frame. That's the arts and crafts style frame that so many things displayed around the hotel were framed. And this is also the design that he commissioned for display in the California schools in 1915. And if we could go to the last slide then, next to the last slide. And so it does appear that it was displayed at least once years later. Remember, the Peace Tower was built in 1925, so about 10 years after the original construction of the peace flag. And there we can see it. I hope you can see that. But that is clearly a flag with a white border. So I'm going to end it there, and I hope we still have time and a few people around to ask some questions. Before we do, I just want to acknowledge the people working with me on our Toward Peace Planning Committee. So and we're going to have a slide in a minute that talks a little bit more about Toward Peace. But the group was originally co-convened by me and Jerry Gordon, and Vince Moses, Steve Spiller, Sally Beatty, and Emily McEwen, all still with us. Karen Rains and Kanani Hupai, who are foundation staff members, were members at some point, and now the foundation's executive director, Jared Hoagland, has joined us. So I want to acknowledge all of their hard work, and for today, I just want to thank Steve Leck, the Riverside Historical Society president, and Kim Johnson for monitoring the questions, and Sarah Allison for technical assistance with the PowerPoint. And I want to thank the Mission Inn Foundation for letting us use its Zoom account for today's presentation. So I want to catch my breath, and then I'll be happy to try to answer questions if there are any. And Sarah, maybe we could just page back and forth between this, and the next slide should be the a listing of the, oh, there we go, some of the Toward Peace events. And maybe just go back and forth between that last image of the Peace Tower and the credit panel and this, so that people can see that as we answer questions. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Theresa. That was very interesting. We've picked up a number of other participants too. So at this point, we'll go ahead and open it up and see if anybody has any questions of Theresa. Go ahead and use the chat function if you can. There, just if you wave your mouse around, it should come up. At the very bottom, you should have a bar there. And our own Kim Johnson will be monitoring that there. So please have at it if you've got questions for our presenter today.
Steve, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I don't have any questions on the chat function yet, but I have to admit I have a question of Theresa. I was wondering if Frank's interest in peace moved down in any way to the next generation, and if his daughter Alice and her husband DeWitt Hutchings did much.
That's a good question, and I'm not really sure that I'm prepared to answer it very, very knowledgeably, because I haven't, in terms of the kind of deep research that I've done on this period. Generally, we think about their interest in air-mindedness and the Flyers Wall. And this goes to Walt Park's work on the Flyers Wall and some of the early notions having to do with flying and air-mindedness. In the earliest years, there was a kind of an idea that the flight would break the bounds of the earth, and it was very hopeful. Of course, that kind of went by the wayside in the First World War, as we see flight being used as a war tactic. The Institute of International Relations did continue to meet at the Mission Inn afterwards, and so the Hutchins daughter Alice and DeWitt Hutchins would have been continuing as hosts for there, but I think that's a area for some good research for someone else.
Very good. We have one person who raised their hand. Do we have the ability to let her speak?
Yeah, I've unmuted her right now, so.
It's Barbara Wilson. She's still muted. Oh, go ahead, Barbara.
Barbara, this is why we ask that you use the chat function, because sometimes it's very difficult.
It looks
I
like
don't know, it's not working. Never mind.
No, it is now. It is now. What do you? What's your question?
Oh.
Barbara?
Lost you.
Oh, can you hear us, Barbara?
Yes, I can hear.
Oh, good. Well, we can hear you. If you have a question, go ahead.
I am just curious.
Oop. Unfortunately, you just muted again.
This one, I've been in other meetings that seem to work a lot better than this one. How early did this interest start? I think you indicated that it was when, 1903? But was that the first time that Frank Miller had been overseas? Since later, so many of his things were from all around the world.
Yeah.
How did this go from the beginning until the end of his life as to what this was all about?
Very good. So that's a good question. And I have to say that the first documentation that I have of Miller actively involved in formal peace activities is that 1907 visit to The Hague with Aletta Jacobs. Now, the thing that's important to understand is that there is no body of correspondence of Miller or talking about his peace activism. Everything that I've found is just bits and pieces and different correspondence with different people. And also, as we know, so often with Miller, what he's interested in, what he's involved in, what he thinks is really portrayed in his actions. So I think that, I kind of suggested that I'm not sure that we can say that Miller had a real interest in peace as a very young man, or something that came out of a religious tradition or something like that. Of course, we know that he was a member of the Congregational Church, and he was, very religious. A lot of religious thought is punctuated throughout all of his activities, but if you read Maurice Hudgens' book, he really talks about, Miller, he wasn't particularly doctrinaire, I think Maurice uses a phrase like his own individual moral philosophy was developing. So I think we have to kind of go by that. I started with Teddy Roosevelt primarily just because that's such a great story. That's a great image with him. But I I do think that Miller was had a bit of a, I don't know what to call it, maybe like a political crush or something on Teddy Roosevelt. Of course, we know that he was Miller was very interested in trying to get a hotel in Yosemite, and he lobbied Roosevelt directly for that. And having Teddy Roosevelt there at the Mission Inn ultimately became a big part of the Mission Inn story and the advertising mythology and so on. But there is also, I think, a real admiration for Roosevelt. And so it couldn't have escaped Miller's notice that Roosevelt is such an early awardee of the Nobel Peace Prize. And again, I'm a little reluctant to talk too much about, or authoritatively on what I think about Miller's thought processes and personality, because he's kind of difficult to pin down in a lot of times. But I do think that in general, I've been thinking about this. In general, somebody asked me last few weeks ago if he was competitive with the Smileys, since they were also hotel people. Well, of course, their hotel was in New York, but I thought about that a little bit more. And, it's not that he's a bad businessman or anything, but he's not particularly competitive. He's always looking more for ways for other business people to cooperate and promote the whole town or the whole hospitality industry in Southern California. So I think that in that sense, he was more of interested in cooperation. And I do think religiously, though, that he just thought that war was a crime, bad. And of course, anytime that there's that kind of international upheaval is going to be bad for someone whose business is international travel. So.
Thank you, Theresa. We have one last question. James Ferguson wants to know, how do we get access to the other webinars that are listed on this last page here that's showing right now?
Yeah, so if you'll just Google Mission Inn Foundation, some of them are yet to be up on the page, on the web page, but they will be soon. In fact, in the next week, registration information for the Securing the Vote, History of Women's Suffrage event should be coming out on the Mission Inn Foundation's website. And so that will be the best way. Thank you.
Okay, Kim, Judith Runyon is
Yes.
asking, there we go.
Oh,
Judith, can you hear us now? Can we hear you?
there we go. Now, let me see. Barbara is unmuted. I'll mute her, but Judith, if you could unmute. I don't know how.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Theresa. That was a wonderful presentation, very informative. I just have a question about Andrew Carnegie. Was he at the international conference that was held in the music room in 1911? Because I thought that he was, and also that he had funded, the Andrew Carnegie Foundation funded that function. Is that correct?
He was not at that event, as far as as I know, and as far in regard, what I know is from the sign-in sheet, the names that I had on the slide are names that I transcribed from the handwritten sign-in sheet for that event. And actually, this is a little deep in the woods here, but Maurice does say in his account, his biography of Miller, that Carnegie funded that event, but I don't believe that that's the case. And there's some confusion because David Starr Jordan had an existing relationship with the Carnegie Foundation. So there's several Carnegie Foundations, of course. So Jordan was a board member of the main Carnegie Foundation. And also Jordan's teacher's pension or his educator's pension was invested through some kind of investment option in the Carnegie Foundation. But I am certain, because I actually have looked at the correspondence between Jordan and Edwin Jen, and I know what the progression of their discussions were in regard to Jen's interest in involving Jordan. And I know that Jordan, as he was putting it together, spoke of it as part of his responsibilities to his contract with Edwin Jen and the World Peace Foundation.
I see. Okay, well, thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah,
thank you
thanks
very
for
much.
asking. That's a cool little detail.
Okay.
Okay, that's all we have right now.
Okay, well, thank you again to Theresa for a wonderful presentation. Folks, do keep watching your email for other functions that we will have through both the RHS, the Mission In Foundation, and the like, because here's, of course, all of our events coming up soon just on that. We will try to keep you up on what's going on with the Historical Society. And of course, once the journal comes out, then you'll be told how to get a hold of your copy then. So unless anybody else has any other questions, again, thanks to Theresa, and we will see you next time, whenever that may be.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. So, oh, everybody's leaving. Sarah, are you still on?
Yes,
How was that? Could I be heard okay?
I heard you fine.
Oh, good.
I
Okay.
think there's still some attendees in the room.
I know. I know many of them.
There's some- Do you want me? I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording.
Yes, that'd be good.